Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Sabir, pronouns he, him, and I run events here at the Strand. Before we launch into a discussion of Hari Ziyad's newest book, Black Boy Out of Time, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third-generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors like Hari, George, and Candice, we wouldn't be here today, and we are so appreciative of that. Tonight, we are thrilled to have with us Hari Ziyad for the launch of their newest book, Black Boy Out of Time. Hari Ziyad, pronouns they, them, is a cultural critic, a screenwriter, and the editor-in-chief of reshape. They are a 2021 Lambda Literary Fellow, and their writing has been featured in BuzzFeed, Out, The Guardian, Pace Magazine, and the academic journal Critical Ethnic Studies, among other publications. Previously, they were the managing editor of the Black Youth Project and a script consultant on the television series David Makes Man. Hari spends their all-too-rare free time trying to get their friends to give the latest generation of R&B starlets a chance and attempting to entertain their always very unbothered pitbull mix, Keone. For more information about the author, you can visit www.hariziyad.com. Joining Hari in conversation is Candice Iloh and George M. Johnson. Candice Iloh, pronouns she, them, is a first-generation Nigerian-American writer and dancer from the Midwest by way of Washington, D.C. and Brooklyn, New York. She's a proud graduate of Howard University and alumna of the Rhode Island Writers' Colony. She received her MFA in creative writing for young people at Lesley University. Her work has earned her fellowships from Lambda Literary and Bona, and a residency with High Arts where she debuted her first one-person show. She lives in Philadelphia. Everybody Looking is her first novel. George M. Johnson, pronouns they, them, is a writer and activist based in New York. They've written on race, gender, sex, and culture for Essence, The Advocate, BuzzFeed News, Teen Vogue, and more than 40 other national publications. George has appeared on BuzzFeed's AM to DM, as well as on MSNBC. All Boys Aren't Blue is their debut and was an Amazon Best Book of the Year, an Indie bestseller, a People Magazine Best Book of the Year, and optioned for television by Gabrielle Union. The New York Times called it an exuberant, unapologetic memoir infused with a deep but clear-eyed love for its subjects. At the time of publication, George used he, him pronouns. Speak with them on Twitter at IamGMJohnson. We will first begin with a reading by Hari, then a reading by Candice, and then begin the evening's discussion. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Hari Ziyad to the stage.
Thank you so much, Sabir, and it's such an honor to be here. The Strand is actually one of the first bookstores I've ever entered. I went to NYU for undergrad, and so when I moved here, it's right down the street. So it's just really beautiful to come full circle and to be here. And to be here with such amazing people like George and Candice, who are two of my favorite folks. I'll be reading from a chapter in Black Boy Out of Time called My Gender is Black. It's actually an excerpt that was published this morning on NBC. So if you do really like it, you can go find it online later. And I'll just jump into it. By the time I normally reach my subway stop, the white faces mostly seep out of the subway. Nostrand Avenue acts as the Brooklyn-bound C train's water purifier. White folks are the residue extracted through distillation, but there's no one to change the filter when it stops working, when gentrification really comes for us. That summer day, I was exhausted, but my dog couldn't have cared less. Hopping up and down in excitement as soon as I opened the door, I changed into something more appropriate for, sorry, this out of order because I printed this. for weather as she followed me to every room I walked through, waiting patiently at each entrance, tail infused with a jolt of life whenever I happened to make even the briefest eye contact. Just give me 1 second, everyone, while I get these pages together. I ended up printing the excerpt from NBC because it was already edited without reference to things that would have come before. And in the process, I did this. Okay. Okay. Let's start back at that sentence. That summer day, I was exhausted by my dog, but my dog couldn't have cared less. Hopping up and down in excitement, as soon as I opened the door, I changed into something more appropriate for the weather as she followed me to every room I walked through, waiting patiently at each entrance, tail infused with a jolt of life whenever I happened to make even the briefest eye contact. Let's go, Kia, I said, throwing on her harness. Once upon a time, I didn't like going for walks around the block. For Kia, I do it twice a day, and in return, she never leaves me alone for too long. He mad nice, old dude shouted at me from across the street, holding onto the A as if he lost it too soon, he'd lose himself. Or maybe he held onto it just so that he could lose himself in the expanse he created with it. I didn't know, but I knew that he was from Brooklyn. The way you hold words means something here, something about loss and survival. It's not always easy to tell which of the two. It's not always a binary. It's not just how long you hold the words, but where you let them drop and where you pick them back up. What breed is he? She's a pit bull, I respond, but my voice, being the light, baseless thing that it is, abandoned its mission halfway across the street and never reached his ear. Huh? Pit bull, I said a little louder, the effort of speaking at grown man decibel levels taking the air out of me. He waved me over. I was walking the other way, but I didn't want to be rude, so I crossed the street, a little relieved that I wouldn't have to shout anymore. Kia was confused by the sudden departure from our regular walking routine and resisted, so I used the harness to pull her back. Google says if we deviate from the same routine, the same route every day, she won't be so hard-headed about walking, but she's too hard-headed to deviate. What breed? Oh, dude repeated. Pitbull, I responded. What? He hella small. He full grown. He friendly. She's mixed with a bull terrier, I think. This is as big as she gets. She's nice, to people at least, I laughed. Old dude laughed back and leaned down to scratch Kia behind her bat-like ears, courtesy of her possible bull terrier lineage. At this point, she was happy to have been dragged across the street, but I knew she still wouldn't go without a struggle next time. Google stays wrong. Niggas around here love my dog. Niggas around here love pit bulls, period. But there's something about Kia that really gets them. I imagine that they love pit bulls because the breed has been unfairly written off as some monstrously violent and criminalized through breed-specific legislation, and niggas around here know what that feels like. But Kia specifically, it's his pure coat, oh dude said. Shit is dope. He looked up while holding the O, and I was sure he would lose himself when his gaze stopped at my midriff. But his eyes eventually still made their way up to mine, and he still smiled. I could tell this was not a flirt, and still we survived. Up until then, I had forgotten I was wearing a crop top, although what the hell else would I be wearing? Certainly not that damn button down. It was over 90 degrees that day. This was the only attire that made sense to me. Sure missed those days. And for just that moment, it seemed to make perfect sense to old dude as well. For that moment, he could talk to queer old me without restraint, without feeling a hatred toward his own relationship to manhood, and without taking that hatred out on me. Kia does that to dudes around here, or to me. I'm not sure whether it's that walking my dog makes cisgender straight black men in this not yet fully gentrified Brooklyn neighborhood more comfortable talking to me, or me more comfortable talking to them, figuring they won't wild out around a pit bull. It's not always easy to tell which of the two it is. It's not always a binary. What's his name? I'd used female pronouns each time I referred to Kia, but to no avail. To dudes around here, she stays male, and that's that. And it's not just dudes. Most people I come across seem to automatically assume Kia is a male dog because she's a pit bull. I'm not sure what they think all these male pit bulls mate with to procreate, but I guess they haven't thought that far. I assume this has something to do with the breed's supposed physical strength and aggression, which patriarchy tells us cannot belong to women. But why did I feel so inclined to correct old dude while calling him old dude, while gendering him too, as if my assumptions about his gender didn't have far greater consequences than his about Kia's? Gender is so fucking weird. Kia, have a good one, bro, he said with a final stiff pat on Kia's blocky head and left. I hate being called bro. I've never felt like a bro or a man or a mister or a sir, although boy and brother and girl and sis feel okay for some reason. When I talk to customer service representatives over the phone with my baseless voice, I sometimes get called ma'am, which doesn't feel right either, but I never correct them. What would the correction even be? All these words feel like cages to me, like I'm being forced inside them against my will, being aligned to the world's conceptions of gender when my Black experience has so little to do with the world's. But there, with old dude, with Kia, the words stopped feeling like a shove. It was about how long he held them, where he let them drop, and where he picked them back up. The Brooklyn way, the Black way, fried and buttered like. Here's where you lose the violent limitations and find a place where you can truly survive. Here's where I find a God who can repair the fracture caused by my carceral dissonance. For a second, old dude and I were able to lose ourselves beyond the way that words like straight, dude, bro, and gay defined us, even if those were the best we could formulate in the moment, because we weren't stuck in just that moment. For a second, we were able to lose ourselves beyond the way these words villainize and criminalize and cage us, and beyond the way these words might sometimes make us feel hatred toward ourselves, and the way we might sometimes take that hatred out on one another. We were just two Black people in our still not yet completely stolen Black Brooklyn hood, not being made to harm each other. I didn't really have words for how freeing this was, but I tasted them. They were there. Thank you. And apologies for the paper. Oh my God. What just happened? Oh, thank you. Sorry, my screen just did something weird. But I think I'm still here. Apologies for the paper mix-up and for that little mix-up. Hope you all enjoyed. I'm glad I get to go before Candice because no one wants to come after Candice, who is just an amazing, amazing writer. And we'll be reading from their book, Everybody Looking Next.
Hello, hello, hello. That was such a beautiful, beautiful reading. I'm really, 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 really happy to be here. And I almost forgot that I was reading because I was just lost in that. And I was inspired to change what I'm going to read based on what I was hearing. So, Hari, I'm reading this section for you. A thick cloud thrust itself out into the air at the entrance of the dark blue row house we could already hear from down the street, as if it had been waiting for somebody to set it free. Off-campus housing, apartments with their own set of rules, set by upperclassmen who've earned rights to wreck eardrums, lungs, liver. Damp bodies so full they tip over, pour out onto the sidewalk with the smoke. Kendra pulls me in before I can change my mind. In my mind, college parties were painted just like this. Everything too loud, everywhere too dark, everyone close and touching. Kendra leads me to open space toward the back. We pass by walls that dudes lean against, not yet drunk enough to dance, talking to girls not yet drunk enough if grabbed to go along. Reach the kitchen, where everyone surrounds a table with cups, bottles glisten being passed and emptied under dim light. Standing behind it, Elliot at the center, a red cup in hand, the other rested above a freshman girl's booty. Look who it is, shorty with the smart mouth, always giving somebody a hard time. What you drinking tonight, he asks, placing his hands on the table, leaning over the bottles, his attention fully turned toward me. You need to loosen up. We all here to have a good time. My eyes flick down at the can of soda already in my hands. Thanks, but I'm good. His smile widens so I can see how he gets first dibs in action, then glances at Kendra, eyes scan the full length of her body from behind the brim of his cup, sips and asks, "And what about you, sweetheart? Don't tell me you scared of a good time too." It couldn't have been more than 15 minutes since we'd gotten there, but we felt the steady press of new people at the party on our backs getting harder to hear and the bodies forced to move in tight. Kendra takes a step closer to the table, making sure her eyes meet with Elliot's. "Scared for what, sweetheart?" "We're good. Besides, I bring my own good time," she air quotes. "Who knows how long you've been at this table running your mouth or what type of shit you've done to these drinks. Be careful, sis," she warns the girl, still waiting silent behind Elliot, with a paused look over his right shoulder, grazes my arm as she turns toward the music and walks away. Elliot throws up the Black Power fist, mocking Kendra's solidarity with his next freshman conquest, laughs to himself, opens his mouth to say something else to me. I hear nothing now, with my back turned, but the sound of the music growing louder above the crowd. See how Kendra swings her hips with her eyes closed, lets herself sway solo to the beat. In just minutes, watch how many hands of sweaty unknowns she swats, dodging entitled boys' advances drawn to her free curves. Watch her wave off attention most girls wish for. Watch her shoo away come-ons in the dark, attracted like flies to a dangerous light. She opens her eyes only for a second, coyly smiles with them, using them to invite me over. At first, I think to say no. Then I let my body take me. Minutes later, the crowd becomes a circle around me, around us, feeling the music like every song is mine, every drum kick, bass line connecting her winding hips and my thighs moving in and out. We don't notice the crowd thicken till the DJ shouts us out. We still forget people are looking, feel myself lose it, hearing hip hop shift to soca, then become Afro beat. Feel rhythms rock any inhibition I came with. Feel every surface on me moisten. Feel my center tingle rise, heat. We're snapped back into reality when a girl whose face I can't really see bumps too hard against me. On her way to the bathroom, a guy who looks familiar trails close behind her, one hand on the small of her back, holding her steady. A familiar wave of heads turned toward the shiny figure's sparkle, beaming both from her lips and fingers covered in rings. I stand still, squint for a better look, recognize the gloss, the sea of the same admirers, the dumb smile, charming and ugly, just before they disappear behind a closed door. "Are you thirsty? I think I'm gonna get a drink. It's hot as hell in here." "And you were gone. Didn't know you could move like that." For a second, I don't realize who's talking to me. "Huh?" "I said it's hot. Do you want something to drink?" she says, sounding irritated this time. "Damn, one minute you here, the next minute you not." Kendra. "Shit. I'm sorry, Her hand goes up, motioning me to stop. "Fuck 'em," she reminds me. "I'm actually ready to go for real. You hungry?" Before Derek and Sarah had walked through the crowd, it was only me and Kendra in that room, sweating, owning the floor like we were somebody's backup dancers or like two hot girls in a cool club somewhere in New York City. The sexiest things under red lights where everybody dances consumed in their own world before Sophia barely made it back there drunk in her two high heels before Derek followed behind her like a dumb dog after his bone. It was just us and I was free. Thank you.
Amazing. And I'm so glad you read that. Like, I see so many shared themes between what I read in that as well. It's just beautiful about like how we see each other before all of this other shit is like put onto our lens. And so I know we had like our earlier discussion points outlined, but let's start by talking about that. In particular, as it comes to queerness, how you are able to just exist as a queer person, and in what spaces you're able to do that. And I guess, Candice, we can start with this story, but also if there are aspects of your own life that you can bring into it, to just discuss this whole phenomenon of being able to really witness other people in Black spaces, and what are the things that contribute to that and take away from that as a queer person?
That is such a great question. Honestly, not to be cliche, but a lot of my practice when it came to showing up as my full self in spaces was in dance studios.
Mm.
And like, it's just, queerness is just so thick in dance spaces. Like, you know, like, it's just, you see all types of gender expression happening. You see so much fluidity. You see so much intimacy happening when it comes to like touch and how close you have to be sometimes when you're performing with other people. It's just, that was the beginning of me really coming into like being able to feel what's going on in my body and how my body is responding to another person. So from there, it just kind of branched out to all art spaces. Like, creatives and artists are the ones who embraced me first. And then from there, I just decided I only want to do things where people embrace me like that. Like, I'm not working anywhere where I have to hide. I'm not writing shit that I have to like pretend I'm something that I'm not. I'm not socializing with people who can't even freaking like, you know, respect pronouns. Like, like it got to a point as an adult where I just started to realize like I have a choice about where I'm gonna spend my time and who I'm gonna spend my time with. But it was like, it was these creative spaces that came and embraced me first before I even knew like the fullness of who I am. And that's still like unraveling every day, I feel like.
Yeah, yeah, and that really resonates with me because I read about in the book as well in college. That's something I was struggling with. Like I was like, oh, I couldn't find my community, but it wasn't because they weren't there. It's just I wasn't looking for them or doing the intentional work that you're outlining of like going spaces where you're welcome. And once you realize that you have the agency to do that, things just shift. Because I think, at least it shifted in my life. I lived so much of it thinking that, you know, the community would just come to me, but community is an active process, and I think it's even more so for queer people, and that's the beauty of it too. I mean, it's hard when you don't know where to start, but once you're on that journey, the beauty of actually building your own community around things that you believe in, around people who will respect your pronouns, is unmatched. I want to keep doing this for the rest of my life, and I hope that I do. George, I want to hear from you, though. I know that you also are in a fraternity, and I wanted to just ask how that comes into play there. As a queer person in a fraternity, that's when we first talked, that was one of the most interesting things, because I just thought that was not a safe space for queer people. So tell us about your experience with that and how you were able to really witness yourself and your queerness, and go into spaces where you can witness other Black queer people as well.
Yeah, the fraternity situation is very interesting, and it's getting more interesting by the day as I become more visible and you know, start to become, quote unquote, the face of our organization in many ways. I think we are reaching a crossroad at, you know, a decision having to be made of, you know, do we support the notion of what George is and who George is fully, or do we have to go to this place of trying to reject who George is fully, and do it in a public way, because I'm never not going to say that I'm a member of this organization. So the only way that they would be able to refute it is if they publicly stated that some of the things that I did went against, I guess, organizational traditions. It's interesting, though, when I think about queerness, because I never was able to hide it. I was always effeminate. My grandmother, my mother, they knew since I was 2 years old. I was able to recognize by the time I was 5 that I was different. I didn't have the language for it, but I knew I was different. By the time I was in middle school, I knew what different meant. And, you know, by the time I got to college, because I didn't explore in high school, but by the time I got to college, I was able to start to explore what queer community meant. But I also joined the fraternity while in college, and it was interesting because I think there were several members, especially of my line, who were chasing the same type of masculine ideology that I was chasing. And it was interesting because we kind of all ran into each other as queer people. So I have 4 other line brothers who are also identify as gay. And there were 9 of us altogether on my line. And so once I went into the fraternity, what I found interesting was that there were a lot of queer people who existed within the fraternity. And so is it a welcoming place always? No, but it started to become a place where you cannot refuse the existence. I always get a little pissed off at like when people start talking about inclusion, because it's like, I'm not asking for inclusion in something I already exist in. And so I just refuse. Like I refuse to even have conversations around inclusion, especially when we're talking about the fraternity, because I'm already here. Mm-hmm. So we need to be having more discussions about, well, since we're already here, how do we make these things, these systems and these ideologies that we are trying to uphold fit for everyone who already exists within this space. Mm-hmm. And so, and I guess just from a personal level of like showing up fully as I am, it's a decision that many people have to make every day, right? Like to walk out the house, because even when we try to only exist in queer only spaces, which I try to do primarily, you still have to leave your house every day. And sometimes leaving your house is not, especially if you are performing in a way that goes against the particular community that you live in. I used to live in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and I would get called a faggot, like walking up the street, because I am somebody who likes to wear stretch denim.
Should have had Kia with you.
It's not something that they like to see on people who have the image of man walking through their neighborhood is wearing stretch denim. And I mean, that's something that we know across many communities. And so, in many ways you have to make a decision like about like safety and your happiness, right? And so it's like the decision of like, well, what makes me happy is fully being me and showing up whole. And so sometimes you even have to go against safety when making a decision. And that's personal life and within the fraternity. In many ways, my decision to change my pronouns and identify as non-binary and also still say that I am a member of this organization goes against safety, because there are some members who are dead set on holding on to the masculine ideals, but you just get to a space where that type of shit, you just can't care anymore. And you have to care about you and the people who are coming behind you, who are looking to you to showcase what it looks like when we live totally and fully in our identity.
Right. And you talk about like how that is the case when you walk outside of your home, but for a lot of us, that's also the case inside of our homes too. A big part of my book is about my relationship with my mother and her ideas about queerness. And my mother really loved me more than anyone else in this world, but she's also one of the people who probably hurt me more than anyone else in this world because of our tensions around who I was. And a lot of my work about figuring that out is in the book. But I wanted to ask you, Candice, I know that this is a novel. I'm not sure how much of it is related to your own personal life, but a huge theme in your book is as well as the main character is dealing with how these different ideals and gender norms in the house. But it's also very clear that her family loves her. And so what is that tension like, and how do we hold the people who love us accountable? And George, this is also, I think, the case with your fraternity. How do we hold them accountable to the harms that they might cause in that way, while also acknowledging and knowing that the love that is there actually exists? And what are some of the challenges that you faced in your stories, but also in your lives, to threading that line of accountability and in the midst of a very harmful, loving relationship?
So in my real life, I didn't come out until I was 22 years old, and it was the day before commencement at Howard.
Wow.
And I came out to my therapist and I was like, it's my last session, so I feel like I need to tell you something. And she just kind of looked at me like, duh. So I, like that is, it's a constantly unraveling thing. Like I don't see myself trying to hold family accountable. Like either you're going to accept me or you're not going to see me around that much. Like that's just where I have gotten to because I fought throughout my whole life. I've always been very confrontational, very straightforward, and it gets exhausting. Trying to convince people that you love to like see you. But in the book though, the main character goes back and forth between trying to please family and like figure out what pleases her. Like it's just confusing to her the whole entire time. And I wanted to play with that tension because it's easier said than done to just dismiss your family. Like it's just, it can get really ugly and you still just are like, well, they raised me, like I love them, like they're, that's my dad, that's my mom, that's my whoever. And so I really wanted to show in the book how confusing it could be to be a teenager navigating that, because you don't even have language maybe for what you are yet. You don't know how to describe what's going on in your body. So it's a lot of work for a teenager to then try to like be an advocate for their identity with their parents. It's like, hey, I'm still the same me. Like, I'm changing just like everybody changes in life. Like, everybody evolves. It's just like the evolution of coming into the understanding of your queerness is like something that people for some reason don't see as the same evolution as anything else. So it's just, it's in my, in my regular life, like the whole accountability thing and is just, it doesn't come up as much because I'm really intense about my safety and protecting like where my brain goes psychologically when I deal with this.
Which can be accountability too. I think the most significant shifts that happened in my relationship with my mother happened around times when I was just like, no, not coming back for Thanksgiving if this is the case, not doing this. And that can be, I think when we think about accountability, it's a very binary, like it's supposed to be this soft and like it's not a difficult process, or it doesn't feel it doesn't feel uncomfortable in that way. But I think that's kind of limiting what accountability can be. I think accountability is whatever is done with the goal of making sure that harms are repaired and healed from. And so I definitely think that what you described in your own life is another example of holding people you love accountable. George, did you have any?
Yeah, I mean, in the book I write about dealing with, sexual abuse from a cousin. And I remember when I wrote the chapter and like one of my editor, her note was like, you're going to have to put like a disclaimer at the end of this because you just wrote about this so beautifully. I don't want people to think like it's okay. And she was like, you didn't say it was okay, but she was like, you're writing about this from a way that's not punitive. And I've just never seen that. And, a lot of people comment on that chapter specifically because like my cousin is dead now. And I was like, well, you can't hold somebody dead accountable. Like, I don't even know what that would look like. But I think just from the way that I have processed even that situation, I kind of carry that into how I process accountability now for others. I truly believe like in saying it, like this makes me feel is something that I have had to work on and work through, especially when a person says it to me, like this made me feel when you did this. And so I think, when I look at accountability, it's like kind of like you were saying, it's like a communication process, right? And just like you said, no can be a part of accountability, right? And telling a person like, well, I'm not going to do this if this is what you're saying is going to happen. But yeah, for me, it's not been an easy journey to be this radically transparent. And I hope that, more of us are moving towards a process of accountability that doesn't necessarily lean so heavily into punishment, but does lean more into restoration. But it does require a level of, transparency that I think many of us are just simply not used to, especially when you think about like the parent or the older person, younger person dynamic of, like this whole notion that parents can't apologize to kids, and it's like, no, they should apologize to kids if they harmed their child. Like that is what an apology is for. It has nothing to do with age or respect or a level of anything. But I think because that is so ingrained so heavily into society, we haven't really, or we're just now, I think, breaking ground on what real accountability looks like from a micro level and a macro level. And so, yeah.
And on an internal level too, like so much of all of our books, I think, deal with how those harms, in particular by like people that we love. I think there's a reason that we internalize those same types of things, and we struggle with the way we see our body and our queerness and how we move throughout the world using like the same kind of self-talk that we might have heard, because these ideas become so they ingrain themselves in every aspect of our lives. And so a huge part of all of what our characters in our books are dealing with is figuring out how to live and move beyond that, what they've internalized themselves. And so I wanted to talk to you all about what that process looked like for you, what your mental health journeys looked like as queer people who had to break out of these social constructs that were put on you. What do you do today still to challenge that in your life?
Are you saying like in terms of like what practices we do?
Yeah, practices. Yeah, like how are you challenging those messages that are still so prevalent? I know, I mean, we're talking about it, so we have awareness of it and we can challenge it, but it's still difficult. Like I still wake up and if I don't catch myself, I'm like, oh, do you really want to wear that skirt? Right? Like, and those are ideas that are not coming directly from me, but through this like gendered lens that I've internalized. So how do you work through those feelings, and is that connected to your mental health journey at all? Then I'd also love to hear a little bit about that journey too.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I'm thinking about it, I call it micro abolition. It's like, what are you abolishing in your day-to-day life? Like, I think like macro abolition is like, we need to tear it, like, abolish the police. Right. But like in my day-to-day life, micro abolition to me is like abolish the notion that you can't wear this crop top outside. And so it is a daily struggle because I do still find myself at times like, do I want to wear this outside? Do I feel like having a safety issue today? Do I feel like dealing with stares? Do I feel like dealing with people questioning this? I think about when someone misgenders me accidentally. Do I feel like correcting the 8th person today? I've corrected 7. Do I feel like really correcting the 8th person? Some days I do, some days I don't. I work hard to have more days where I do, but I also know who I am. So it's like a duality of, well, I know who I am, so I'm starting not to even care. Like, all I can continue to do is try and fix the structures and hopefully have that type of effect, trickle down. But I feel like when we're talking about this specifically, it's like the micro daily things that we're trying to abolish and fight, which can be not only like time consuming, but also just overwhelming and pull from a lot of spaces and that internal thing that, needs to be recharged so often. And so I guess my mental health practice is the fact that I have an altar set up to my ancestors that I pray to every morning. There are times in the middle of the day that I go to it for solace when I'm like scatterbrained and all over the place and just need to talk out loud about situations. So that has helped. And I guess rest and not feeling bad about it has been like the biggest thing that I've learned. Like, I am not ashamed if I go to sleep from 1:30 to 3:30 in the afternoon. I don't feel bad about it. I don't feel like I missed some emails, or that, the 9 to 5 industrial complex means that I have to work on that same complex. Like I look at it like that, and I think I just kind of work through it, doing the best things for me moving forward. Because like you said, you live in an anti-Black world, which means you live in an anti-queer world. So you wake up with everything against you. So I'm just starting to learn, like, to wake up and do more for me, for the betterment of me, which in turn is for the betterment of others.
I love that you mentioned altar work. You all probably saw my post at the beginning of the year. Like, my mission is to convince every Black person in my orbit to set up an altar. And glad I don't have to start with you, because you already got it going. Everybody in my orbit's going to have one. Same here. It's been super critical, especially with the process of like losing my mother and finishing this book. But Candice, I wanted to hear a little bit about your practices as well. How do you work through the internalized things that are taught to queer people and Black people that limit us and our expression of ourselves?
Well, I've been in and out of therapy since I was 18. So talking has helped me a lot. Like, just, I'm a very vocal person, and so it's been very healing for me to say things as they come up, rather than continuing to hold things in the way that I learned to do as a child for safety. I remind myself regularly that I'm grown and I should say exactly what I feel in certain moments, so that I'm not carrying so much in my body long after people have said the thing and have forgotten about it. So that's something that I'm really intentional about, is just like making sure I get my feelings off as much as possible. I also, like, throughout this like past year, I've just made sure that I'm surrounded by a lot of images that are affirming to my identity, and like remind me that like all the things that I am are really beautiful, and like it makes a huge difference, like what you surround yourself with in your house, and how you position things, and like even going against how a house was like decorated when I was a child versus how I actually want my space to be set up, including having altars, including having like little corners that celebrate all the things that I am. And I also take lots of breaks. I take lots of breaks so that I remember to breathe, because I was taught some time ago that like breathing impacts the way that you think and your perception. And so I just, even though this world would have us like working around the clock, I take so many breaks, because I'm just like, we could die tomorrow. Like, I need my quality of life like today, like right now.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, and George mentioned rest, like especially right now in the pandemic, like we're just pretending like the world is still going and we have the same obligations, but it's not sustainable. So I'm glad you all are taking that time, and please remind me, like if you ever feel it in your spirit that I need that reminder, because I probably do. My last question before we get to audience questions, George, I'm glad you brought up abolition, because that's exactly how I would describe it. The way we police ourselves is rooted in the same punitive ideologies that uphold the police, which is really what the book is about. Internalizing the concept of abolition so that we can see and act it out in everything that we're doing, in our interactions with our friends, our neighbors, our family. What are the things that you can do to be less punitive and more healing focused in how you address conflicts? But that reminded me of a line from Candice's book, when Candice, you're talking about Ada's father, and you say, I wonder if when he warned me about strangers, he also meant the police, which I thought was just a really interesting way to introduce the concept of how children start thinking about police. And I wanted to talk about when you were introduced to police and how that message started to show up in your life, how did your parents ingrain how to respond to police? And was that a successful way of positioning your relationship to the state?
So, fun fact, that particular scene really did happen in my real life. And that was my introduction to the police on a really like personal level. I don't have much like memory of police, like I've heard about like some kids being introduced to police in their household as like community helpers, like a firefighter or like a nurse. I don't remember ever having conversations like that with my father because we're Nigerian, and like some of the things that I've heard about my dad growing up with surrounding like how police are there. I've never had the idea that the police were my friend. Like I've always believed that I just need to stay as far as I can away from them, including like staying out of trouble. Like, parents will say like, just stay out of trouble so you don't have to deal with them. And we know better than that. Like, we're going to interact with law enforcement in various ways without doing anything. But I've never thought that the police were my friend. I think I've always been taught to caution and to like just, get away as quickly as possible and don't get mixed up in situations where I'm stuck around them. I feel tension when I am in the same area as police. I don't feel safer. And so I don't know. I think like it was introduced in the book also as another kind of authority, like, this queer teenager wrestling with the idea of authority and who she should listen to or not. And I think it's really confusing for Black kids and Black queer kids to figure out who they should listen to, because adults sound like they don't know what they're talking about a lot of times. Like it's, like the way that politics kind of shows adults constantly going back on what they said they were going to do, constantly fighting, constantly calling each other names and lowballing. I feel like it teaches kids to not really trust adults because it sounds like adults don't know either. So I think like when I thought about policing as a child, I thought about like which authority is like worthy of me listening to them, like who's telling the truth here.
That's really interesting. And yeah, I would say that the aligning police with authority in that way really resonates with me, but it was also that part of the distrust that I had for the adults in my life was when they were acting like police, when they were trying to like police the things that I were doing and punish me in that way, which is why so much of the healing that we have to go through is to abolish the police in our heads. So yeah, thank you for that. But George, do you have any similar? I know you come from a family with police in it.
Yeah. So my dad was a cop for 30 years. And so I grew up with the police in my household. It was interesting growing up in Jersey with the police because the same way Candice was saying, like you got introduced to the police in your schools. And so you had the DARE program, which was, I feel like it was started by Nancy Reagan, but I could be mistaken, but I'm almost certain that it was started by them Reagans. But it was like whatever it was called, it was like the Drugs Against something program. It was the DARE program. You used to have to wear these T-shirts and say that you wasn't going to
Yes, I remember that.
In school, and like the cops would talk to you and all of this type of stuff. And so it was interesting because I also lived at home with a cop who was high up in the force, but dealt with a huge racism issue within their police department. And so they had their own separate group called Ebony, which was the Black police officers. And they used to have meetings at my house. And so I knew all of the Black cops in our town because all of the Black cops would get together monthly. And my dad was the president of the Black cops at their police department. My mom, thank you, drug resistance education. My My mom, actually, she was a secretary, the head of the secretaries at the police department for many years. She sued the police department over racism and won. And so I've just had a very interesting relationship there. And I will say, my dad being a cop didn't change the fact that he still told us that there were things that we could not do as Black kids. Like, we got toy guns, but we could not go outside with our toy guns because he was like, one of them cops will mistake y'all and shoot y'all. Like, y'all cannot do what the white kids do. And so even though, you know, he was a cop himself, he was still living with the understanding that he was still Black and raising Black boys at the time. And so it was very interesting because the older I got, I think the hatred I had for cops grew, because once you're outside of your household and once you're outside of your city, the cops are white. And even if they are not white, and they're Black, they don't know you. And so you then get your first real dose of what policing is, outside of like this bubble that you may have been in or grew up in, like in my case. And so I've always known who the cops could be, what the cops were. Growing up in Jersey, Jersey was the state for racial profiling. That was the thing that put us on the map in the 90s. We were they did a whole investigation, and the cops literally, it was called racial profile. That was the first major case of racial profiling, where white cops would sit on the highway and pluck cars off the highway that had Black people driving them. And I used to get stopped regularly because I went to school in Virginia. And so what my dad told me was that a lot of times they would track certain tags because they would think that they were drug runners. And so if your car made too many trips within a short period of time from north to south and you were Black, police officers would stop you. So these were not like conversations that like my dad was not having with us, or like that we did not know. But yeah, I definitely lived at the intersection of police. But now I want to abolish them all. So I guess it worked. I don't know. I guess he's out of the police department and I want to abolish him. So I guess it worked.
My sister is actually a police officer as well. I'm also identified as an abolitionist, and I just wrote an essay about that whole tension. So I hope it resonates with you. Should be out sometime this week. But thank you all so much for this amazing conversation. I think the folks from the Strand are come in for the Q&A portion. Sabir.
Hi. So thank you so far for a wonderful discussion. We have a good mix of audience questions. I think a great one to begin with would be from India, who asks, what was the first book or TV show you saw where your Black queerness was reflected? And I think if we could go Hari, then India, then Hari, then Candice, then George.
That's an interesting question. I always love when people talk about representation because my experience was totally different. I grew up in a Hare Krishna family, and I was homeschooled, and we didn't have cable, and like didn't really do anything. Like, we were those weird kids. But the flip side of that, or the good side of that, was that I never really knew that I wasn't being represented on the screen. So I think we have like this innate, as people who just exist, like we have this innate idea that we're legitimate, and it doesn't need to be reinforced so often until you start putting all of these other messages into the mix that we're not legitimate and our existence doesn't matter, or our existence only exists in a certain specific way. And so it wasn't until I started getting introduced to a wider variety of media that I realized that there was actually a problem. Like, I felt represented in my household, in my family, in my community. And so a lot of my work around the concept of representation really speaks to that, that the problem is not just that Black kids, Black queer people aren't represented in these ways. It's that we have this whole system of representation that exists to delegitimize our existence. And so how do we challenge that? When do we start talking about the first times we didn't feel represented, and pinpointing the problem with that narrative is something that I try to push for in my work.
I can't remember. I can't remember any. Um, is the am I, is everything cool with the screen? Because I'm hearing an echo. Okay, cool.
Okay.
I can't remember a show that made me feel, I guess, like represented because I don't know. I think I grew up seeing, even in queerness, seeing like a strong binary, seeing super masculine queer women and femmes, and then very feminine queer women and femmes and non binary people. I hadn't seen much for androgyny. So, like, I feel like I got most of the times that I have felt represented or I felt like I was in the work was in books. I feel like I'm just now starting to feel like I'm seeing characters that I identify on screen as an adult. I have no recollection whatsoever as a young person. I feel like the film industry is kind of behind in comparison to books, because I just feel like there's just more that can happen in books. Like they're not using images, and so there's a lot of space to insert yourself into the narrative, and like there's a lot of space for you to just assume it's about you. Whereas you're watching something on screen, you know that's a white person, or you know that's a black person. You know they don't look like you. So I can't really pinpoint anything, and I also, I guess to piggyback, I don't think about representation as much as like I don't know. I want everybody to be able to be making their art as authentically as possible. I feel like yeah, I feel like this is a tangent, but I feel like in general, if we were all making art specifically about our nuanced experiences, it would just be an array of things that we'd have to look at and to read. But this whole representation thing, I feel weird about it too whenever a question like this comes up because it immediately makes me then realize that I'm other. I don't assume that I'm other. I feel it when that question comes up.
Yeah, I mean, I always say visibility and representation, like it's a starting point, not an ending point. And so I think people oftentimes look at it as like, oh, you made it. Like, look, y'all are on TV. And it's like, well, girl, that's the start. Like we got some other things we gotta fix first. Um, I'm 35, so I grew up. No, there was nothing. It wasn't a thing on TV. I think by the time I got to high school, you had Queer as Folk, and that was white gays that was doing a whole lot. They was doing a whole lot, and so I was like, oh, okay, like y'all do a lot. Like that's all I could think of was like, well, this seemed like me, but they doing a lot, and I think then we got to the real world, and that was the first time we saw Karamo. And I think for many of us, it was like, oh, okay. But do I think like we've been like represented or like have I seen it? No, because everything is so finite. Like everything is so it's so named, right? And so it's like we don't see like a person's journey. Like we've never seen a person's journey through queerness, right? Like it's just like this is gay person, and then this is trans person, and then this is, and it's like, well, I started as a thing, and then I became another thing, and now I'm this thing. So it's like, well, where is that person, right? Right? Why do those people not exist that are still figuring it out? Because it's not something that everybody just gets, and then you just are that thing. And so, yeah, I think like Candice said, books, you can find it much more in books, especially young adult literature. Young adult literature does really, really well with infusing and encompassing all types of queer characters. But in terms of media, TV portrayals, I think we're still pretty much around like the standard idea of queer. And we haven't fully pushed through yet, but I think we're, I don't know, we're on the brink.
So our next question is from Lena, and it pivots nicely off of George's answer, which is Candice and George, in writing YA books, why, or were you writing books for your younger selves? But to pivot that a little, why was YA the best medium for you to present your art?
You want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go. It's interesting because I think originally I thought I was writing a book for my younger self, but I wasn't. My book is my younger self writing the book to my older self. And so that's what I actually learned, was that the person that never had the voice finally got the voice in my book. And so I think and it's interesting because I think that's why the book has resonated the way it's resonated, because it's unlocking people's childs and like teen, like it's unlocking that. And so a lot of people are going to that place, but it's able to unlock that because it's written by a 5-year-old, and it's written by, and I've intentionally used incorrect language at certain parts because older me knows knew about dead naming, and older me knew about these things in our community. I did not know that at the time. And I remember when writing the book, I had to make a decision, like, do I write it for who I was at the time, or do I write it as I am now? And I made it an intentional choice to write it from who I was, because the teens who are reading it need to know I didn't have all my shit together. Which goes into why I wrote it for teens specifically. They're the next generation that's got to fix it. Well, I hate to say it like that because we put so much weight and pressure on them, and that's sad, right? Like that we keep putting shit on kids to fix it. But if that's what the current society model is, then I want to make sure that they at least have the resources to know what they're going into, and that they at least have the resources and the tools necessary to fully understand what they're going through and the people who exist around them. And so, you know, I argue all day with people who are grown as hell, and they ain't gonna get it and they ain't gonna change. But what I can do is put work in the world that I know is getting to people whose minds are still being shaped. And so if I can get the text to the people whose minds are still growing and who are still much hungrier to understand how the world actually exists outside of what they're being told, then I know that I can actually create real change in society. And so that was pretty much what went into my decision to go YA.
I chose YA because I think the lives of young people are the most interesting. And I feel like the most intense things happen during our coming of age. Like if you are trying to know like why a person is the way that they are, you look back at like what happened in their childhood and like which kind of turns they made before they became a real adult. And so like I mentioned earlier, like I've been in and out of therapy for a long time, and it made me very interested as an artist, about very, very interested in those trigger moments, those things that we flash back to as adults when they remind us of something that happened when we were kids. That's just very interesting to me in storytelling, period. I love backstory. I love to know why a character is the way that they are. And I also just, as a teaching artist, I spend a lot of time with young people, and because I chose to be a teaching artist, I had a lot of freedom to just give them space and allow them to share things. And I got to just learn so much about what young people are going through right now that I couldn't not write my story in that time. There was no way that I could not make this a YA story, because that's just where it all began. Like the teenage years it's just so much there. Especially if you were raised in a household where you were repressed and you never got a chance to actually say certain things out loud. Like that's the stuff that I really want to explore.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one last question, so I'll end with this one, which is from Michaela, who says, Hari, how did you find peace / taking care of yourself while writing your memoir?
I feel like I'm still trying to figure that out. But so much of it was related to what George said earlier. I knew that this work was going to be dealing a lot with grief and death. And so I had to set up my altar. I start the book off talking about my grandmother and that loss that I never really had engaged with on that level, and I'm like, oh, this is the kind of work I'm going to be doing for the next 3 years. I need to like really fortify this connection. And Alter work is very similar to a lot of therapeutic practices in that it's really about just reinforcing the things that your body already knows. And so there's just been so many times where I've just been sitting in the altar, like anxiety going nuts, and just listening to what my grandmother is telling me. And then after my mother passed away, her too. So that was huge and integral. I was also doing therapy. I don't know how anyone writes a memoir without being in therapy, because I wouldn't have gotten through it. And that helped a lot. So much of the book is rooted in inner child work, which is something that I was doing in therapy, and I decided to just incorporate into the book. Half of the book is written to my younger self to kind of mirror the work of inner child work. But ultimately, it was because I had a great support system. I mean, I was going with George to write every other day, and my partner here was also just willing to read all of my work and give me feedback on that. And I couldn't imagine not having the community of people because I question everything that I write. And so particularly when it's this personal, I would have just like drove myself nuts if I didn't have any feedback for 3 years while I was putting a book together. So I'm so grateful for people like George and Tim, my family, who were willing to give me feedback prior to this coming out, because I needed a community. I couldn't write this book on my own, and that includes my therapist, that includes my ancestors, and it includes my friends.
Thank you so much for, well, for one, ending on that lovely note of community and putting together this beautiful event filled with community. For everyone watching, thank you for spending your evening with us. If you haven't purchased Black Boy at a Time, there's a fun green button at the bottom of our screen which says purchase. You can click on. I've dropped links in the chat to purchase Candice's book as well as George's book. And again, I just want to thank you all for a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
On that note, everyone have a great night. Thank you for letting us run over a bit. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Sabir. It's so wonderful to be in this space.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hari.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Candice.